Finally, we end with politics during the Mao era and their legacy for the China that we see today. The real goal of a communist state, we need to understand what a communist state is really about, because a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of propaganda, a lot of just communism as a curse word, and you don't really understand what the goal is of the states that have communist parties in power. In the 20th century, generally speaking, the big communist states like Russia, like China, their goal is to achieve industrial parity with the capitalist and much wealthier Western countries, Western European countries, the United States, as soon as possible. You have a chip on your shoulder, you have a grudge, you generally think that you are looked down upon, or possibly, in the case of China, invaded and colonized by these other capitalist states. And your goal is to try to use communist ideology to achieve industrial parity with them so you can match them on the battlefield. You need heavy industry to do that. The sort of factories, chemical engineering factories that are going to allow you to build nuclear bombs, aircraft carriers, fighter jets, steel factories, bridges, these sorts of things, so you can be self-sufficient and not so cripplingly dependent on the expertise and the resources of the wealthier countries. The problem, however, is that communism arose really in the major states where it took power and had global influence. Those were generally poor, overwhelmingly agricultural states, Russia and China. It didn't take place in the rich ones. Very hard for a communist party to gain power in a relatively wealthier state. There's a lot of other forces in that society that are going to actively work against the rise and influence of a communist party. But they do take power in poor agricultural states that are riven by civil war or global war. World War I in the case of the Bolsheviks in Russia, World War II, Civil War, subsequent Civil War in the case of China. So the problem here in China in the 1950s is that China is a poor agricultural state. It has a lower industrial level than India does, newly independent India. So you can see the state of China's industrial development at this time period. So the problem is you're poor, you have no money, no cash reserves, you have no capitalist investment because you have very hostile relations with the capitalist world. That's a bad thing. They're the wealthy countries, so you're not going to have any capitalist investment, and you've just been torn apart by war and civil war. What's your solution? Something known as primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation basically says that our only resource is the countryside, agricultural surplus. What we need to do is, in order to get cash reserves, foreign cash, so we can invest it in steel factories and whatnot, we need to get the peasants in the countryside, our main resource, we need to get them to produce as much agricultural surplus as possible. Not for themselves, not so they can fill their bellies, although we may be telling them that's what it's going to be for, but so we can take away everything beyond bare subsistence needs, sell it on the international market for countries that don't grow as much of their own food anymore because their economies have shifted to more advanced sectors, and then get the cash where we sell the grain so we can finance heavy industry. The only debate here is about speed. How fast is this primitive accumulation going to go? In other words, how can we get the peasants to produce as much as possible? And Marxist ideology tells you that collectivism, putting more people together in ever larger organizations overseen by the wisdom, the infallible scientific wisdom of the Communist Party, is how you're going to do this. So in the 1950s, again, this is big bird's eye perspective. You could dissect each one of these things in an entire hour-long lecture. The big picture perspective is how fast are we going to collectivize the peasants into ever larger groups and units and de-incentivize individual wealth and investment in mutual aid teams, cooperatives, and eventually communes. Because if you're a wealthy, rich peasant, you might have more money you want to put in and less labor to these sort of new collective entities. And gradually that's going to be phased out so that everyone is contributing the same amount of labor. And the idea is that if we do this right, eventually we'll have like 100,000 people, entire counties in one big commune, all pooling their resources, all pooling their labor, and we'll be able to overcome our material handicaps, our poverty, to sort of leapfrog, catch up with the industrial Western advanced countries like Britain. So they start off with what are known as mutual aid teams. 5 or 6 households, you all know each other, you're still able to contribute some money if you have it and less labor. Then they wrap this up to low-level cooperatives, then high-level cooperatives, and then finally during the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1961, we're talking about communes. Enormous, you can't possibly know everyone who's in there. And the idea is that with all the resources pulled together, we'll be able to buy tractors in order to make our fields more productive. Now, all of this plays out in the politics of the Mao era. This is what the debate is always about. This is the form that tension takes during the Mao years. How fast are we going to do this? There's no question over what the ultimate goal is. Of course, communes are what you're supposed to be getting to. And that's when we'll have plenty, and we'll be able to sell stuff on the international market, invest in heavy industry, and the peasants will have tons of food to eat because we'll have so much food, right? But the politics are determining how fast we're going to go. Mao is always saying faster, 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 faster. Other people in the party who might actually have, an economic education or something like that, are saying, wait a second, this goes against all objective laws of agricultural development and economic rules that we know. You can't go this fast. It's going to be total chaos and disaster in the end. So Mao's seeing resistance, saying, we need to go like the Soviet Union learned already. You can't go too fast. They had their own collectivization campaign in the late 20s and 30s, and it was a disaster. Let's learn from them. They already went through this tragedy. Let's learn from them and go slower. 5-year plans, steady, 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 and gradually, another 100 years or so, we'll achieve communism. Because communism is supposed to be achieved over a very long time period. Mao doesn't have 100 years to live, and he needs to have success now because that is his only source of political leverage. Think about this. Mao becomes a burden after 1949 for the Chinese Communist Party. Previous to this, it was one success after another. Whether or not he was responsible for that success or whether or not it was larger conditions that created his success is irrelevant. It's perceived that the success is due to him, okay? To him. And so his leverage, his excellence has to do with his base of, with the one thing that he has a proven track record that he's good at, revolution. He's seen as the master of revolution. Mao created the revolution, overcame all odds. All the naysayers said, you couldn't do this, and he said, I can, and lo and behold, he did. Oh my God, the Chinese Communist Party won, and they took power. So no more questioning Mao, all right? Stability and gradual prosperity based on technical experts who are educated and know what they're talking about and use economic models to project how fast you can do things, that model of economic development makes Mao irrelevant. Irrelevant. So he has to constantly go back to his one proven strength to keep himself at the forefront of the party and not become just a figurehead. He's not going to be content with being a figurehead. Some of the top leaders are content to be figureheads. Zhu De, leader of the military, is happy to be a figurehead. Not Mao. He wants to always be in the front. He is the leader. And he's got a cult of personality and a proven track record in being a revolutionary expert to constantly win the battles and say we need to go faster, advocate for a faster speed. Okay? This will eventually lead to the disastrous Great Leap Forward, going to communes way too fast without adequate preparation and it just being a complete waste of resources. And then people realizing, hey, we also didn't grow any food. We took everyone away from the farms to make useless steel. We thought we'd be able to overcome by sheer human will our shortcomings in not having steel factories, and we would just sort of throw all metal into these backyard furnaces and create good steel, catch up to Britain in 15 years in steel production was what they said. How does he win these arguments? He keeps exploiting new constituencies throughout Chinese society to fight party rivals on his behalf. He starts off trying to recruit urban intellectuals who he thinks are going to support him and think that he's right. We need to go faster and faster. This occurs in the mid-1950s, 56, 55, 56. This becomes known as the 100 Flowers Campaign. He invites criticism from urban intellectuals. Please criticize the party, thinking they're going to criticize only his enemies. They don't. They criticize everything about the Chinese Communist Party. That leads to Mao having to do the Anti-Rightist Campaign, clamping down on them, sending them to prison, all this sort of stuff. All right, urban intellectuals are not going to be on Mao's side again. Great Leap Forward, he's drawing upon the peasants. All right, peasants, we're going to help you. I need you to show that you can go faster. All the naysayers are like women with bound feet. That's one of his most famous quotes. Tottering along. We can go faster than that. Then the Great Leap Forward's a total disaster. We went too fast. We ignored the objective laws of economic development, and 30 million people starved. And then finally, the Cultural Revolution is essentially him saying we need to go fast again. Revolution. The revolution is the only thing that keeps Mao relevant. not steady stability and growth. He has no expertise in that. And so he draws upon teenagers who have wholly grown up under the Mao years to pursue the Cultural Revolution, attack his enemies in the party, and say, we're creating revolution, a more glorious future. Finally, in 1976, the torment of the burden of Mao and his only source of leverage being continuous revolution, because that's what it was before 1949, finally ends when he dies. Now, we'll finish off with the legacy of the Mao years. The legacy of the Mao years is that, ironically, it facilitates very swift reform to curb and counteract the excesses of Mao's constant revolution. And there's probably quicker reform after he dies than there would have been if he didn't have his constant crazy political campaigns that he was always doing. And it also facilitates re-engagement with the capitalist world, but on China's terms. Post-Mao leadership, Deng Xiaoping will repudiate the Cultural Revolution and try to reappraise Mao as a patriotic symbol and strip his importance as a policymaker. They'll say all of his important stuff happened before 1949, and we want to just valorize him now as a patriotic symbol. Let's put his portrait on Tiananmen Square, and he's just a symbol of the Chinese nation and the Communist Party. We need to kind of forget about the Great Leap Forward, the Anti-Rightist Campaign, the Cultural Revolution, which are officially repudiated, especially the Cultural Revolution, because that was a very visible one that affected all sectors of society. Okay, the gradual erosion of communist ideology occurs as the party opens up to the capitalist world, but not the legitimacy of the party. The party says we keep China strong as we re-engage the predatory imperialist capitalist world. You need the strong party. That's us. And we made China wealthy and ready to engage the world on our terms, despite the constant chaos of Mao Zedong and his political campaigns and his continuous revolution. Despite the constant chaos, factories were rarely touched during the Mao years. Great industrial strides were made. Factories were always protected during these chaotic political campaigns. China detonated its first homemade atomic bomb in 1964. Okay, that's a significant scientific achievement that they were able to do, because the Soviets decided they weren't going to share their atomic bomb blueprints with them. So, these things have like having the atomic bomb. That allows China to re-engage the capitalist world from a position of strength on China's terms. It opens up what are known as SEZs, special economic zones, in the early 1980s, mostly southern cities, in which foreigners are going to be able to have capitalist investment in China. But importantly, it's on China's terms. It isn't like the old days where you had unequal treaties and then you could use those concessions to sort of chip away at China's political sovereignty. Now it's going to be, if you invest on our terms, we're going to work together with you. We're in charge and we can put you into jail and you don't have extraterritoriality anymore. It's going to be on our terms. And some companies will say, okay, I'm still worth the risks. I'm going to ignore your human rights abuses. I'm going to ignore this and that because I can make a lot of money in China. Other ones will fall afoul of the party and go to jail and be kicked out of China. China's in charge here. You can't bring in the gunboats anymore. You can't hold up the unequal treaties and say, hey, you can't do this. Yes, they can, because the foreign imperialists are gone. Right? In the new era, the wealth will be dominated by those with party connections, because all capital was translated into political capital during the Mao years. There was no private property or commodities. It was translated into political capital. Who owns all the political capital? People in the party. So when you start issuing new permits for land purchases, for permits to build new factories and whatnot, and to get grants, agreements to have foreigners invest in your city, the party controls all of that. So all the new millionaires, all the rich people are going to be people with party connections and their children. All right, political capital is being translated into economic capital. So long story short, again, big picture, because we can't go into every single detail, we see an East Asian world today. The legacy of the Mao years, the Communist Revolution, is an East Asian world increasingly molded, or at least challenged, in China's own image. The United States has a lot of influence in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, a crescent all around China, and China's chipping away at that. All right, China's chipping away with that on its own terms. All right, this is the important thing. You don't have the imperialists able to sort of sink their tender hooks into your country anymore. All right, and do as they please and dictate terms. Now China has the military. They have matched the Industrial Revolution advantage that the Western countries and Japan used to have over them. And so the world is increasingly molded in China's own image. They have their own alternate internet, their own alternate media, their own alternate political system, economic leverage around countries around the world. We say that you can't recognize Taiwan. All right, some people say, well, that's ridiculous. Why not? Well, we won't trade with you. Bye-bye to the Chinese economic market. Oh, that's a big loss for people. Taiwan's a great example of how they can push their weight around to get what they want. Right? For better or for worse, China is back at the helm of East Asian politics and economy on its own terms and directly challenging the influence of the United States that's been entrenched there ever since the end of World War II. Many people thought, oh, the more they engage with the United States and Europe and whatnot, the more open and free they'll become, open media, plurality of voices. The internet, of course, is going to get through the great Chinese firewall, right? No, they created their own alternate internet. They have a whole alternate universe that the Chinese people live in, and they can maintain it. We haven't chipped away at it at all. This is having political sovereignty over your country, reversing the imperialist excesses of the former years, and coming out onto the world stage. Now it's no longer the communist bloc, capitalist bloc. China is in many ways a capitalist country now and able to engage the other wealthy capitalist countries on terms that are increasingly to its liking, and try to reestablish China's formerly preeminent position as the center of gravity for politics, economics, the military, and culture. Well, culture is still something that Japan seems to have the upper hand in, but nevertheless, China is making inroads in there. And that, to me, is the real legacy of the 20th century revolutions. If Chiang Kai-shek didn't have World War II and the Japanese invasion, if he had managed to survive, he would have done this too. To me, it doesn't matter whether it was communist or Chiang Kai-shek or whatnot. Whoever was the power that managed to control China after the foreign imperialists had all been kicked out after World War II would eventually manage to do this. It just so happened to be the Chinese communists, and that is the legacy that then they get to claim as their mantle for the China that we see today. You want to engage China, it's going to be on our terms, and you can't just bring out the guns to change it to your liking anymore. We're back to George Macartney in 1793. That's what we've returned to today in the 2020s.